say who they are, give you a sound of their voice initially, and then we'll start our discussions looking at the Montserrat volcanic experience. That's what we're going to do with people who have played a key role in the events, especially in the earliest days, and in the case of one of the guests, continues to play a leading role. So I'm going to start on my left with Dr. Keith Rowley. Good morning, Dr. Rowley.
Good morning, Frankie. Good morning, Montserrat. Good morning, Caribbean. Good morning, world. It's so good to be back here. I just feel as if, time has stood still in a way. I can hardly believe it's 30 years since we have been grappling with this issue of the Emerald Isle and volcanic eruption. But it's good to be here, and I'm very pleased to see that we have with us, some of the people who started out on the journey of civil defense here in Montserrat, and we're still here to look at 3 decades of managing a natural phenomenon, which is an integral part of Montserrat, and I dare say the wider Caribbean experience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowley. So I go on my immediate right, and when you hear this voice, for those of you who are adults in Montserrat, I'm sure it'll flood your mind with memories. So, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this radio broadcast. I'm Frank Savage. I was the governor of Montserrat from 1993 to 1997, and during the period 95 to 97, we all went through a very difficult period. Although I left in 97, my heart never left Montserrat, and this is my 10th return visit. All the previous visits have been largely in conjunction with disaster mitigation work on behalf of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. But each time I come back, I shouldn't be astounded, but I'm warmly greeted by everybody. The warmth of the greeting in Montserrat is unsurpassed. So I'm very pleased to be here today.
Thank you very much. I almost said Governor Savage. It's been such a long time referring to you as Governor Savage. And then I go to my far right.
And I say good morning to those of us on this side of the Caribbean, and good afternoon to those across the pond. This voice is no stranger. Frank and myself have been around from the start. People have blamed me for the start of the volcano. People have also blamed me for stopping the volcano in 2010. So Frank and I clearly have to take responsibility for the start of the volcano. The gentleman on the far left, although he is referred to as Dr. Keith Rowley, I want to let one and all know that he is Prime Minister Keith Rowley, the immediate past Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So Prime Minister Rowley, my brother, welcome to the studios of Radio Montserrat once again.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thank you for those introductions. And what I'd like to do, each of you mentioned being here at the start of volcanic events. And I'd just like each of you in turn, and it doesn't matter the order and sequence in which it's done, as far as I'm concerned, but just give us a sense of what it was like, your first experience. I know yesterday there was a little bit of discussion in the case of Mr. Savage about what it was like at the very beginning, and of course the Premier will have his story. I know I have mine. I may not be able to share that much of it today, but let's just reflect on what it was like for each of you in the very beginning. Let's say for those first few days and weeks. How did it strike you? What went through your mind? What were the issues? What were the concerns, the anxieties? And Dr. Rowley, you came as a professional at the time. You were not in your capacity as a politician, and you will explain, of course, but we'd just like to get that perspective from each of you. What it was like, first contact.
Yeah, could we get as we normally played it back in the day, the governor first, I will follow second, and Keith will come afterwards. So Frank,
Mr. Savage?
I'm throwing you in.
Very happy to be thrown in head first. I'd like to go back 2 years before the start of the crisis. Veronica and I arrived in Montserrat in 1993. Briefed in London quite extensively, and also in BVI and in Barbados, on the history of Hurricane Hugo, the devastation, the most powerful hurricane in the Caribbean in 100 years, and how Montserrat had magnificently recovered under the premiership, or the chief ministership, as it was in those days, of Reuben and his team. And Montserrat was, as far as I was concerned, a jewel in the Caribbean crown. And over that next 2 years, Reuben and his government brought many things on stream. Foreign investment was coming back to Montserrat. Plymouth looked like a shiny new pin. The community was confident. All the houses had been repaired. The insurance companies had paid out. And there was a general feeling of well-being. And then on that fateful day, you have to forgive me, at 83, my memory for dates is going, but I think it was the 18th of July, 1995. The fateful call from Juliet Braid, 2:00 in the afternoon, to say, Governor, we're getting reports from Kinsale and further south of black snow falling and the sound of a jet engine from high up in the Soufrière Hills. And that was the start of a journey which, as far as I can see, is still going on 30 years later. But the real period, the following 2 years, when Reuben and I worked excessively closely together, and there was never the conflict I occasionally hear between us. There wasn't a single decision which wasn't agreed. Sometimes took a bit longer to reach that agreement, but there was never a decision which was not a unified decision. And we had discussed right at the start that if we could speak with one voice to the community over this fantastic radio station with Rose Willock at the helm, the community would be, if anything, reassured that thought we knew how we were handling the crisis. So thank you for inviting me back for this 30th anniversary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savage. Dr. Rowley?
Well, my perspective is one initially of a scientist. I was trained in Jamaica in geology, and while I was there, I discovered the existence and exposure of volcanism in the region. And as we are here in Montserrat talking about Montserrat's experience, I want to make the point that this experience is not unique or a Montserrat thing, because our islands from Grenada all the way up to the Dutch islands in Cerba and Statia have at least one volcano on each island. And some volcanoes have more than one. Some islands have more than one. And volcanic hazard and the risks that are associated with an eruption became part of my study. And I became the first Caribbean geologist or person to be trained as a volcanologist. And I was sucked in to the university in Trinidad, University Campus St. Augustine, and encouraged to do further training, because the monitoring of the volcanic phenomenon of the CARICOM region is and has always been done from the university campus in Trinidad, even though there are no magmatic volcanoes in Trinidad. But the university had been given that responsibility. And as a response, the university staff, its administration, its budgeting, and its responsibilities interacted and operated out of the offices of the prime ministers of the region. And in here in Montserrat, we talked about the governor. And we had an idea of what we're facing, because here in the Caribbean, in 1902, on the French island of Martinique, a volcano Mount Pelée, erupted after giving tremendous, what we now see as notice, but people didn't understand what was happening. So nobody did what had to be done, which was to get out of the way. And the volcano eventually erupted and killed thousands of people, wiped out the whole city of Saint-Pierre. Only 2 people survived in that city. I think there's 29,000 people were killed. That remained a world phenomenon here in Martinique. And later on, a few days later, the one in St. Vincent erupted and killed 2,000 people. Again, there was notice. But because we didn't understand the phenomenon, the notice was ignored because the danger was not sufficiently understood. But the university spent its time and its personnel trying to understand the course of eruptions, the frequency of eruption, the zones on the islands that would be affected, and so on. So we did a lot of that. But the only signal we really relied on were earthquakes, that ground shaking associated with the onset of an eruption. And we did that by monitoring the volcanoes. And my colleague Richie, who came in after me to the same place, the Seismic Research Unit in Trinidad, we had a historical perspective. In Montserrat's case, in 1966, the volcano had a seismic, what we call a seismic crisis, meaning a lot of earthquakes coming in, indicating that something is happening on the ground. But it didn't lead to an eruption, but it was a warning. And we always knew that there was the potential for these volcanoes, especially the ones that had seismic crises, to come to an eruption sometime. So we had St. Vincent, the Soufriere there, the Mount Pelée, and Soufriere in Guadeloupe. And of course, we did assessments, scientific assessments as to what are we to expect. In my own case, when we did the latest assessment in the 70s, there were 3 areas that we thought were 1, 2, 3 in the volcanoes that are likely to erupt, other than St. Vincent and Mount Pelée, which had erupted in the not too distant past. And we felt that on my list, number 1 was Nevis, number 2 was Montserrat, and number 3 was Dominica. And we worked with that understanding that these are the areas where we have to pay particular attention, because not only are the possibilities great because of what we understood from the science, but on those islands, especially Montserrat, where we had Plymouth, Dominica, where we had capital city Roseau, and in Nevis, where there's virtually no place to withdraw from the volcano. You're virtually living on the volcano. And Montserrat beat Nevis in the stakes. Montserrat erupted before, so we were close, but not entirely accurate in our guesstimating. And when the volcano started to erupt, the next thing is, how long is this eruption going to last? How big is it going to be? And on all volcanoes worldwide, those are the questions that you have to answer. And you usually are making assessments and trimming based on what information you're gathering from what the volcano is doing. So once we saw an eruption, as Colonel Sabri said, once the jet engine began to roar at the top and the black snow began to fall, you were having an eruption. But we were not.
For those of you watching online, we're just doing some housekeeping here because Dr. Richard Robertson has joined us. And Richard, yes, we are online, so there are people who are able to see us, and we need to make sure that they can see you too. So I didn't mean to interrupt Dr. Rowley, but we had to in order for you to get the bearing. So please
the first
continue.
hurdle is that, yes, we're having an eruption. Immediate question, how big is it going to be? Second question, who or which area is going to be affected? And thirdly, how long this would last. Now, in the beginning, I don't think we had much of an idea that we would be here 30 years later dealing with a still described in the volcano of Montserrat, because dome building volcanoes can and sometimes do build a dome and stop. Or build a dome, have an eruption, go back to dormancy, and things go back pretty much to normal. And of course, this situation here where you build a dome, had eruptions, make some damage, continue to have the dome being alive and well, and there's a possibility, while there are low probability, that it may erupt again on a similar scale and in maybe similar circumstances. But in the meantime, we have seen tremendous improvements in the understanding of what is happening on the mountain, in the understanding of the geology and geophysics of the mountain, and the political seasons have come and gone and come again. And of course, we've had the interaction between the decision makers in the governor's office, the premier's office, and of course, the economic and social outcome of a volcanic eruption. Montserrat is a laboratory which should be studied by every Caribbean territory, even the ones without volcanoes, because what you're dealing with here is the management of population, social, and economic issues where there is disruption of one kind. In the case of a volcano, because of the high temperatures and the physical interaction with millions of tons of rocks coming at you and gases hot and poisonous, you're talking about you can't survive it if you are in fact in its way or impacted by it. So it's a life and death situation, and you do not have too much room for error. And so we tend to want to err on the side of caution while not panicking a population that is living with this natural hazard.
Dr. Rowley, thank you very much. I really hope that the recording of this program can be preserved in segments, because that segment that you just provided us of that very clear explanation of what we know about volcanoes now, I think it's something that should be available to students of geography. And I really hope that that is something that we can do subsequently. Now, as we said before, we've been joined by Dr. Richard Robertson, a very familiar face in Montserrat. And yes, we're just adjusting again so that everyone can get in. And
Go ahead, Richard.
So, Richard,
sorry, I apologize for being late. I thought we started at 9:30, so I was going for a 9:30 start rather than 9. But I was listening to you, and I think you were asking about what was the initial experiences when you first came. I think I first came to Montserrat in the middle of 1995, because before then we had been into, I think since 1992, we had earthquake swarms. And in fact, I believe it had gotten so intense that in 1994, William Ambe, the head, he actually camped out more or less. He was in Montserrat for months. He actually stayed there for most of December, monitoring the situation. Why I came in the middle of 95 is because it was when the EOC was opening. Remember, the EOC had a new building close to the police barracks. So we came on the occasion of the opening of the EOC, and we came to actually put on a display on volcanic hazards. We used the occasion. In those days, they didn't have all these fancy graphics. You can have basic cardboard posters and things like that. But we basically put on a display in the EOC on volcanic hazards. And people came in. I think William went out and spoke to various stakeholders. One of the things that I found interesting is that, we kind of spent a week there. And one of the things I actually did physically, I think I came, it was myself, William, and Jody Vine, and we manned the display. But one of the other things that we did is that we were trying to find the old sites where they had been doing ground deformation measurements. In the old days, you remember they used to have these water tube tilt meters, so we were trying to find them to reoccupy them. Not with water tube tilt, but with regular tilt, which was a bit of a challenge, because if you know how they construct it, it's difficult to do it. The point is, the most interesting thing I found is that, so during the week I'm there, right? We're there at the center. People came in, and people seem to be coming in, yeah? Various schools and things like that, and then William going out. Now in the afternoon, when I then go into the town, and Plymouth was really a lovely place. When I spoke to the people in Plymouth, I think for whatever reason the PR was bad, because they didn't know we were having a display. They didn't know about volcanoes. They didn't. I'm telling them that we having this thing. Why are you having it? Right? It's then I then began to understand that people in Montserrat didn't understand the nature of the volcanic hazard the same way the scientists did. And I realized there's a huge gap between what we understood to be the hazard from, well, the risk from volcanism in Montserrat. In fact, that you had a volcano, you were clearly having earthquake swarms by then. By then, you were having some, I think in December 1994, the swarms were so heavy and frequent, and in fact, the earthquakes were so big that people were feeling them. You remember there were swarms, there were periods when they had dense swarms under St. George's Hill and different places. They were sort of distributed, and sometimes they were shaking out the place really badly. So I was surprised that people hadn't connected that to the fact that you had a volcano, because I think then people saw the volcano, go up to chance to speak, you look the whole story of the mermaid, and you look down and it wasn't that this was something that could actually erupt. And I realized from then that we had a problem, that in terms of the public understanding of what the hazard was. And then the next thing that happened, so we were monitoring the situation. The next thing that happened, interestingly, the next time I came was so early in 95. Okay, so I came early in 95. The eruption happens. And the eruption actually happens at the time that there was a conference in Trinidad. GSCT, Geological Society of Trinidad and Tobago, was having a conference. And William was actually presenting on the earthquakes in Montserrat when we got the call that the phreatic part of the eruption had started. And the first thing that happened is that Lloyd jumped in a plane and came up there to find out what was happening. And then subsequently William came, and then I came. I think I came somewhere in July. So it really developed very quickly. But it's two things, as I said. One thing that I noted when I came first is the extent to which that people didn't understand the volcanic hazard, wasn't aware of it. And the other thing was the way Plymouth was. Plymouth was really nice, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Rowley wants to come in before we went.
This is a good point for me to confront something here. I left Seismic in 1991 to go into government in Trinidad. But just before I did that, I think Hugo came before.
89.
And after Hugo, at Seismic, we, following the news, saw where the British government was going to do a lot of helping with the rebuilding of Plymouth. At our coffee table discussion in Seismic, we said, look, based on what Richie just said there, we better go up to Montserrat and tell them, do not spend that money in Plymouth, because Plymouth is exposed to volcanic ravages. I can't remember which agency it was. It might have been the OS, it might have been IDB or CDB, but somebody, one of those agencies, sponsored something at Seismic, and out of it, I was directed to come to Montserrat and do a public presentation on the hazards that are associated with the location of Plymouth and the threat of the volcano in the context of the development program that was anticipated and spoken about.
And just remind me of the year again.
My memory is before 1991, because I left Seismic in 1999. It would have been, I would say, about 88 or 89, somewhere about there.
Okay, Hugo was 89 then, so if it's before 91, that takes us probably to 90.
After Hugo, when they were talking about how much was going to be done to rebuild the place. I had the meeting here, the public meeting here, a Sunday afternoon. First, I was surprised that not very many people showed an interest, but there was a small gathering of about 20 people. And I made a presentation without cardboard, but by speaking to them as a geologist.
That's how it is in the old days.
Yeah, talking to them about that mountain and what it can do and what it's going to do sometime. Maybe in the not too distant future, but sometime it's going to do it. And after we finished, one person who was there was a permanent secretary, who shall remain nameless because I don't know the name. And he stepped aside to me and said, I understand what you said there, but we can't tell the people that. And I was appalled, because I was saying that development in Montserrat should be away from the flanks of the volcano.
You realize, of course, you're opening a can of worms, right?
Well, maybe we need to open these cans. Yeah, but the approach was, what you are talking about there is too difficult to grasp and to execute. Because basically what I was saying is, to develop Plymouth further on the flanks of the volcano, especially after the hurricane, which had damaged. And if you're going to build new things, don't build them there. And I left, understanding that people just not too keen on, nobody's asking anybody to move, but if you're going to invest in a new phase of development, understand that there's a threat of that mountain that could destroy what you're doing. And unfortunately, long and short, that is what happened. The volcano proceeded, after that earthquake swarm that Richie spoke about, the volcano proceeded to erupt. That eruption could have, as some volcanoes do, or as this volcano might have done sometime before, because all these little mountains you see around here, most of them are volcanic domes built by volcanoes, and the dome, the eruption stopped with the dome, and if you go into the valleys, you will see dome collapse deposits and so on. So what we experience here, 95 to now, has been going on frequently in geologic time in Montserrat for time immemorial. So when that eruption started, and it continued in what geologically in its normal way, we had the possibility and potential of escaping it, handling it better, but it required some foreknowledge and some acceptance of what we knew. But sometimes the solution, the pill is too difficult to swallow. I want to say one thing here to volcanic communities in the region. In geology, there's a principle called uniformitarianism. It's a big word, but it's very simple. It means whatever you have seen in the environment that has happened before, it's going to happen again. So if you're in a river valley and you see rocks and things on the flanks, or there's a flat area in front of the river mouth where the river had flooded and covered this whole area, unless you intervene to influence it, it's going to happen again, and the consequences could be graver if you are there when it happens.
Well,
Sorry, Premier, go ahead.
And it's interesting in terms of the history which we're getting. And it's important going forward that we not only introduce these discussions into our primary schools and secondary school, of course. You bring that into the discussion, into the school system very early. Because by the time I got back here in 88, volcano caught me in 89, I had absolutely no knowledge about a lot of the things that you're talking about. I'd been out for about 14 years. But I had not known, other than what we learned in school, that we had a dormant volcano, although we had the soufrières. The discussion as it relates to the rebuilding of Plymouth, again, hindsight is 2020. Those documents were sitting someplace gathering dust. And for those of us who then took over the management of the system, had absolutely no knowledge. So even the Wadge report, the Wadge Isaacs report, which spoke to the volcanic hazards, and the volcano has historically been doing a thing every 30, 35 years or so, a lot of us didn't know about it. So only after the eruption that we started saying, where are these documents? So going forward, it's a lesson which we have to learn, that documentation is important, education is also very important.
But in addition to that, Premier, I know Governor Savage wants to come in here, but I want to introduce a concept, and I want our two scientists on my left to think about this so they can discuss it later for us. We as a population in this region seem to appreciate the connection between the science of hurricanes and the reality of hazards and threats. I want you both, as our scientists, to tell me why you think we don't seem to understand and appreciate the risks associated with volcanic activity in quite the same way. So I want you to think about that and come back. We're going to have Governor Savage come in after the Premier, and then we can come back to the scientists.
Thank you. I really just want to come in to support everything that Ruben has just said. When I was appointed governor in 93. I first knew in the middle of 92, and I started my briefing. I was very hot on hurricanes and the damage that Hugo had done and the reconstruction program. But at no time in London, where I met obviously the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development, called the ODA in those days, at not one single meeting was volcanic risk raised with me. Nobody admitted to having received the Wodge Isaacs report. The first time I heard of that was similar to Reuben, once the volcano had kicked off. Arriving in Montserrat, of course, the entire focus was on the reconstruction program after Hugo. I similarly have the view that much of the reinvestment could, and perhaps even should, have been done away from Montserrat.
Away from Plymouth.
From Plymouth.
Plymouth. But you could look at any country in the world and look at rebuilding after disasters, and very, very rarely is the centre of population moved. 80% of the infrastructure, 60% of the population within 4 miles of the volcano. And now, quite clearly, we ought to have put some of that investment, the major hospital, for instance, well away. I did attend the opening of our new EOC, and I do remember Dr. Amby being there with a display. I would have expected, in hindsight, perhaps for someone to have come to the governor's office to explain how important your volcano is to you. I did briefing in Bridgetown. I had a long session with, was it CDMA or CDMA at the time. There was not a single mention of volcanoes. We employed a leading Caribbean disaster management consultant to come and write the definitive book on danger, risk in Montserrat, and to prepare plans for us to adopt in the new EOC. Under V for volcanoes, it merely said Montserrat has a volcano. So, I mean, I appreciate the scientists now giving us this background, and what we have to ensure in the future is that there is a mechanism for ensuring that that becomes public knowledge, but most important, that the Cabinet of Government is aware of it. I look to Reuben to support me on this. There was not a single paper came to the Cabinet of Government about volcanic risk before the 18th of July. Yes, we now look foolish being told what the scientific community knew, but I suggest going forward that the scientific community have to find a way, a robust way, if at street level, at departmental level, you detect that the message isn't being taken on board, then there must be a way of elevating it to the Premier and in our overseas territories to the Governor, who has constitutional responsibility in this area. We have to find a more robust way. I think, having said that, Montserrat set world standards in how we responded to that volcano. We had fantastic support from, I dealt with more than 120 scientists in the following 2-year period, and for which we are eternally grateful. But the real heroes of this are the ordinary Montserratians who ran the EOC, who ran all the critical departments. 29,000 people died at Martinique on the second day of the volcano. 25,000 people died in Colombia, the seventh or eighth time of the eruption there. My definitive memory is on the 19th of July, when Lloyd Lynch and Dr. Joe Devine arrived and gave us our very first briefing. Immediately afterwards, Joe Devine took me aside, and I think Ruben as well, but I'll leave Ruben to confirm that. Joe Devine said to me, "You are on a hiding to nothing. You cannot win." He recalled the 29,000 people who died in Martinique, and he said that was because the administrator refused to listen to the scientists, and on the second day, everybody in the capital of Batu died. He said, otherwise you will go the way of many governments around the world. Every time we say jump, you will say how high. And then on the fifth or sixth time, when nothing has happened, you get the cry wolf factor, and people will stop listening to you. Now, that was a powerful message which brought home to me the need for us to be ultra vigilant. I think the history will show. We were fortunate. We were fortunate that our volcano turned out to be one of the 10% which went slowly. 90% go fast. Now, in that following 2 years, while the volcano continued to ramp up, with the help of the scientists, we put in place progressive plans for moving the community. Never easy in a country where the northern part of the island had little infrastructure. When we moved people up, they were uncomfortable. They were living in church halls. They were living in tents, many living in their cars. And so each time the scientists were able to relax the advice to us, people came back. It was an incredibly difficult situation. And I agree that people need to look at the Montserrat case, and I hope that they will take some very powerful lessons for the way Montserratians themselves protected their community. And at the end of the day, there were only 14 fatalities, none of whom should have been where
19.
they were, but I don't blame them because of social hardship in the northern part of the island. The farmers came back to feed their animals, they came back to till their lands. But those 14 people were there because of economic hardship. So I think Montserrat is a fantastic casebook. Clearly, I want to defend how the Montserrat government at the time handled it. I'm not certain of what additional measures we could have looked at. We had US FEMA here, we had US aid here. We had the top scientific team in the world, USGS here. The issue of having 120 scientists here was not without its issues, because national groups of scientists tended to have different ideas about where it was going. But we never, ever failed to listen to and react to what the consensus of the scientists were saying to us.
Yeah, before Keith and Richie come in, just want to add one caveat here. Every year, we know the hurricane season starts in June and theoretically ends in October. Every year.
November.
Okay? October, November. Let's not fight over it. In the Caribbean, other than St. Vincent and Martinique and Guadeloupe, the generations were not aware of anything volcanic. Okay? In the case of Montserrat, it was in the days of the original people that the volcano last erupted, although there were signs progressively over the years. And that could explain why a lot of focus is being placed on hurricane preparedness rather than on volcanic. And just to close off, I just want to say one thing here. My other country, Dominica, has a similar situation, and I think we need to place a lot of focus and attention on Dominica, St. Kitts Nevis, even St. Eustatius, that has the cut right in the middle of the island, where we start educating them of the possibilities and the probabilities that their volcano can do the same thing.
Before the scientists come in, let me just say very quickly. Personally, I was very surprised there was someone here at this conference who was not aware that in 1998, listen to the year, Montserrat was asked to assist Dominica in evacuation planning because of the high level of seismic activity in the southern part of the island. I happen to know that because the person that Montserrat sent was me. And I also happen to know that a draft evacuation plan was ready for cabinet within 10 days. Now, somehow, again, the transfer of information and knowledge from one administration, one set of public officials to a replacement set, let's call it, is to me part of the challenge. But I'd like to hear the scientific perspective as to why it is. Premier gave us his thoughts. We seem to get the risks associated with hurricanes and we internalize it. Even, very young children internalize it. It's part of our history. It's written up. We study it. We discuss it. But when it comes to the geological hazards, up to this point at any rate, it doesn't seem as though the information is as clearly understood, accepted, and acted upon. And I'd like us to get the scientific perspective and then come to the question of the sharing of information between the scientific community and the public officials.
All right, if Keith would allow me, because I have a number of responses. I wasn't. Okay, first of all, as I said before, my memory in the first case was clearly that there's a disparity between what scientists saw as a situation in Montserrat and what the people saw, right? And there's a reaction that we then made. But there's a paper that John Shepard wrote at a UA country conference, I think it would have been in the 1990s, which details the extent to which there is interaction between the Seismic Research Unit at the time and authorities, the British authorities and the authorities in Montserrat. I'll send it to both individuals because I wouldn't get into it, to allay the contention that they should or should not have known. There is a detailed explanation of what the interaction was. But the fundamental problem, I think, at those times is that in the times of the model that we use when we interacted, seismic that is, with governments in those days, was that usually the head of seismic would be the communicator. And that's the single funnel. When something happens, the head will speak to, that's how it worked. What Montserrat taught us, and you see that as a result, is that we realized because of the difference that we had to build our capacity in terms of education and outreach. And Montserrat, to a large extent, is what motivated seismic to now have one of the best outreach organization globally in terms of scientific organizations in the world. I can say that without worry. Because what we then did is that, first of all, it started out with a project. We proposed a project to, I think it was funded by USAID, to employ a education professional to work with seismic and its agencies to develop outreach, to develop materials for each of the islands.
So that's a benefit to the region that came out of the Montserrat experience.
So there was a time shortly after, I think it might have been it would have been probably in the early 2000s, where we basically developed brochures, pamphlets for each island, all the volcanic islands. And then there was a campaign that went through the islands that involved public education. That campaign worked so well that we then, once the project ended, we convinced the university to make that position of an outreach officer, we call it, permanent in seismic. We then had a staff position. And upon that staff position, we built the capacity to do outreach. And outreach in our conception, when I say outreach, is a general term to mean taking scientific information and putting it in a frame that is available to all levels. So we now have a program that would deal with primary schools. We could go into primary schools and talk about volcanic hazards and earthquakes hazards and all the hazards we deal with. Secondary schools, we could talk to professionals, university, we could talk to stakeholders. And we have, in addition to the material, in terms of the materials that's packaged, we have video, we have all kinds of frames. And that is what you saw played out in St. Vincent. The extent of the outreach in St. Vincent is a demonstration of the capacity that now exists. Further, we went further to make sure that we then had in the region a storage of all we understood about volcanic hazard. We again sourced through the Caribbean Development Bank funding to develop the Volcanic Hazard Atlas for the Les Antilles. This is a book that contains in it chapters on each island that describes its geology, that describes our most likely understanding of what the next volcanic activity might be, and summarizes all of that. We went further, okay, to understand what it is. And we then took that book, and I was involved in because I was head, because I was driving that. We went physically to the islands, and we handed out the book. We launched the book, and we handed out the book, left, right, and center. We did it to government agencies, disaster managers, we did it to schools, all of that. So if anybody want to tell me no, that you're saying that the region don't know that they have volcanic hazard, it's not because we're not trying. It's because they don't want to hear. And I understand, it's not that they don't want to hear. The fact is that volcanoes don't erupt very often. They don't. And therefore, we are accustomed to not thinking about them. So what we have actually gone further is to now frame the volcanic hazard in a multi-hazard environment. So take it. We built the capacity to outreach. We put all the materials in a frame that people could have as a reference. We launched it, and we're now changing our tack and moving into multi-hazard. And we're now gone further with the volcanic. Remember, I mentioned about the volcanic. You would have heard of the Volcano Ready Communities Project in St. Vincent. We got funded again from, I think it was CDB this time. Was it CDB? Yes. Where we went into 11 communities in St. Vincent at the ground level, at the community level, and work with the communities developing their capacity to understand volcanic hazard in a multi-hazard framework, right? Where they will have plans, where they will train people. We train people, so teams. We working with disaster managers. So again, when you tell us that we have not built the capacity both to do outreach, to put material in the frame, so again, I think I disagree with you that there is on the ground level not an understanding and awareness of volcanic hazard. There is. It's changed because of the efforts of seismic.
It's changed, and we're talking about change over 30 years.
What has not changed
Yes.
is the extent to which governments take it seriously. So we continue to struggle as an organization of the government's funding us, for example. You speak about Dominica. You know how much time I've spoken to the Prime Minister of Dominica when I was head, to the cabinet, to tell them that they have a problem. And they've been a long way. I understand it again. As a politician, and you have many politicians, you have to make certain decisions.
So you're going to put on your other hat momentarily.
So
okay.
If you make any decision where you have to look at the development of your nation, you have to look at it in the frame of all the hazards and all the things. And sometimes you might have to make decisions where it looks like, from a scientific perspective, that you're not taking the volcanic hazard seriously. But maybe you are. It's just that you have other priorities. And I understand that. But my point is that don't come back and say that the scientists haven't given you information. It's out there. It's just that you're not using it.
So, Dr. Rowley, I assume you're going to respond.
I think in his closing phrases there, Richie hit the nail on the head. And that is that you have other priorities. At the government decision making where it's really allocating resources, usually it's money, a volcanic hazard does not jump forward and say, I'm the priority. Because of the infrequency of the occurrence, it gets put back as something for tomorrow. Even though the authorities know about it, they would not be treating it as something that must remain on the forefront of the allocation or response process. But I want to make something very clear. Once the volcano began to erupt here in Montserrat, the response had been remarkable. It had been remarkably responsive, and that continues, which is why today Montserrat is, as I said, a laboratory for others around the world. But what we have to look at is the period of dormancy. The word dormant, Governor Savage would have seen the one line, Montserrat has a dormant volcano. What does it mean? Dormancy could mean that the volcano erupted 1,000 years ago. And in that context, a cabinet will not come out and say, hey, let's run down the road and do so and so. In the case of St. Vincent, Richie outlined what happened in St. Vincent. I grew up in St. Vincent on volcanoes, but that volcano has been erupting fairly frequently. And that frequency has found a part of being the narrative in St. Vincent. Old people would have passed on news to other people. So by the time we got there, there was some knowledge. But even so, that volcano erupted in 1812, built a new crater at the top. So it must have been a big eruption. Before that, it had erupted in 1718. Then it erupted in 1902. But in 1902, even though it erupted in 1718 and 1812, which in geology is frequent, it killed people on the sugar estate in 1902. Because while the volcano was building up and began to throw out ash, and there were earthquakes and rumbling and there were noises, and today that wouldn't happen because you would know what it means. Work was going on at the sugar estate until the pyroclastic flow came down and killed 2,000 people who could easily have moved to Chateaubriand and be saved. And then after that, it erupted again in 1971. So when the eruption started in 1971, the government had to respond because the government knew what happened in 1902. The volcano stopped in the lake. The dome never exploded. The lake, an island was built in the lake, and that was the end of it. That was 1971. I came in there in 1973. Seismic and UWI were on it with the government, and interestingly, the response to understanding what was going on and having the government fully informed was between the University Seismic Research Unit and the Office of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent. From a junior geologist to head of seismic research, I worked out of the Office of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent. Once I landed in St. Vincent, I had a vehicle assigned to me immediately, P3961, a Land Rover.
Impressive memory.
Yeah, and that's how it went. So the people of St. Vincent were also, the people of Sandy Bay, who were closest to the volcano, Fancy, Owia, they always knew during my time that you may be called upon to move because, and the children are growing up knowing that there's a threat there that could displace them. So St. Vincent has been responding remarkably. But don't take it personal. Don't put this as some blame on the politicians of Montserrat or something special about delinquency in Montserrat. Around the world, there are far worse situations. There's one Italian city right now with about 2 million people exposed to what Plymouth was exposed to. Yeah. Right here in the region, in Mexico, in Nicaragua, in all the way down to Chile, we have volcanoes. So volcanic threat, volcanic hazard is a worldwide phenomenon where the feature exists. But because of the infrequency of some volcanoes, the populations put the response low down on the top totem pole of responses. And some places, and volcanoes cover the whole gamut. In Stromboli, the volcano erupts now a number of times per day. In Mount Etna, it erupts maybe every few years. And then you have a different response by the population, which is exposed to that kind of frequency. But when you talk about dormancy, I'm particularly concerned about Nevis, because you could have an eruption beginning in Nevis, but there's nowhere to withdraw to on the island that would be deemed to be safe, because it's just one small island, and the volcano on a small island is a big problem. And in the case of Dominica, when we had a number of crises, seismic crises in Dominica, even though you're picking up the earthquake details, there are so many possibilities of which mountain is acting up, because Dominica has a number of sites which are dormant. The youngest one is in the south, and you're not sure whether it is this one, that one, or the other one, because it's a small area with a lot of volcanoes. And the capital city, I'm pretty sure, was built there because it was the only flat, or it was the flattest area available in this mountainous island.
It was on the leeward side, and those days shipping was important, so the
And
shelter
it was
on the
flat.
leeward side was important. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a built on a pyroclastic farm.
And the reason why it is flat, the reason why that area is flat, is because there's a particular type of volcanic eruption, which is something called an ignimbrite, where the rock is extremely hot, fluid, and it flows and it ends up with a flat top. That's why the place is flat. Because one of those volcanoes, at some time in the not too distant past, produced an ignimbrite flow. And as I said earlier on, if it happened before, it could happen again. And therefore, when you're looking at the hazard, you have to take that into account, that this volcanic center has the chemical capacity, physical capacity, geological capacity to produce this horrible ignimbrite flow, which is rock, molten rock, flowing at temperatures of approaching 1,000 degrees centigrade and flowing like a river.
Gentlemen, for me, this has been an education in science. And I think we have about 20 minutes or so left on the program.
I want to just switch to something else and away from volcanoes. But coming back to volcanoes, we know we have hurricanes every year. We know the destructive nature of hurricanes. Yet you can go through the region and you see hotels continuously being built on the beaches, knowing fully well that it takes one hurricane to destroy all of that. Now, I want to look at Cayman Islands, for example. 7 Mile Beach, which was a fantastic and beautiful beach, is now no longer a beach. Most of the buildings are collapsing into the sea because they're continuously built up where the tourists and the hotel industry saw it as being a good place to build. We have hurricanes every year. It will not necessarily hit you every year. So we take a chance, because we may be hit by a hurricane once every 5 years or once every 6 years in terms of anything significant. So when we now talk about volcanoes, that may happen once every 100 years, once every 1,000 years, you understand why people are sometimes so reluctant to take the volcanoes seriously. And my final point is this. You will hear persons over the years in Montserrat talking about building a bridge across Belem Valley. I'm possibly one of the few voices who is saying, just take a walk down to Belem Valley, turn your back and look north, and focus your development north of Belem Valley. Let the southern part of the Belem Valley be for sand mining, geothermal development, and yes, some persons who want to do housing development. Because if you look at the Rabaka, persons used to cross the Rabaka Drive Valley to do their thing until they eventually built the bridge, which got washed out anyway. So we have to now look at where do we focus our attention and our investments. And in the case of Montserrat, we have to focus our attention on housing development and so forth in the north of Montserrat. Don't bother think about building an airport back that side. Don't make sense. Don't think of going back to W.H. Bramble to clean it off and build over there. But you hear those sentiments from the Facebook experts. And these are things which we have to continuously work on. And I'm very passionate and very worried about Dominica, maybe because my wife is from Dominica. But
I'm worried too.
okay, but it's the what if, okay? But you're still having significant investments being made on the flanks of active volcanoes. Look at Nevis. What do? Do they leave Nevis? Look at St. Kitts, because you talk about Nevis. But St. Kitts volcano is also right in the middle there, with the flanks coming down.
But again, you see, the volcanic frequency allows, if it is that you're going to get an eruption every 200 years, and you build on the volcano, close to the volcano, you get 200 years of use. Yep. But then a day is going to come where that usage is going to be disrupted.
The 90% of the investment will have
The
gone.
unfortunate thing, you don't know when that 200 years is going to
But I agree with Keith, is that in my perception, when we say that people need to learn to live with the volcano, you need to understand the volcano such that you develop things and you make use of it in the intervening period, knowing that at some point. I think what tends to happen in the region is that when we say living with the volcano, what people do is bury their head in the sand and assume it will never happen.
Right.
So they then develop things on the volcano which they expect to last forever. And it's not. And then they're surprised when it happens. I think there's a way in which you can have a balance. My problem is that in some parts of the region, there's an attempt to stick your head in the sand, even though you know it, and Dominica is one of those places, for whatever reason, and ignore that this hazard exists. Because I guess you think that is insurmountable, you can't deal with it, but I think there are ways that you can. You can develop things. I see it all over.
Richard,
you say, which is one of the reasons why when we look at south of Montserrat and what can we do in the south of Montserrat, we have to look realistically at utilizing the south of Montserrat, but for specific things.
Okay, before we get too deep into the south, I'd like to give each of you just a moment to think about what Richie just said, living with the volcano in the Montserratian context as we look to close off the program, because I think we probably have about 15 minutes left. But I'd like to come back to something that I'm going to put Governor Savage on the spot with, and perhaps you, Premier. Transitions. Sharing of information from one administration to the next. Sharing of information, particularly in the leadership of the public service. What ideas do you both have of things that can be implemented practically in the region? We don't have the sophistication of the transition period that you have in the United States, for example, when you have the change of our presidency. But what, in practical terms, do you think can be done to ensure that information, let's say in the case of the public service, Governor Savage, that would have come to the upper echelons of the public service, gets transferred, so to speak, from generation to generation in the public service, or from leader to leader at the level of governor and deputy governor?
Well, this is an important issue, and I think the answer lies in your public servants in whichever country. All governments, irrespective of where you are in the world, are not responsible people by and large for passing on the lessons of their administration. But that is the role of public servants. The very first thing I did when I went to be governor of the BVI, based upon my admiration for what public servants had achieved here, was to order a top-down review of the public service. The public had no respect for public servants. So we engaged a very prominent permanent secretary to lead a 3-year program. And one of the issues was to have an archive, a handing down process of the major issues. Because your public servants are the people who have to ensure that successive senior public servants know the issues. You cannot expect an incoming new government basically to be interested in what's gone on in the past. Politicians are primarily their vision for the future, for their territory, for their community. And that's probably right. But it's the role of the public service to preserve the history of the community. I don't know whether you're going to come back to me because I've got just one final thing I want to.
Well, if it's final and you say it now, then you still would have said it. Yes, you want, Dr. Rowley, you want to come in on this?
I hope you'll come back to Governor Savage.
Okay.
But as I'm listening to what is being said there, let me just say something. Politicians have a responsibility which public servants don't have. And politicians have a requirement to be fit for purpose. And therefore, in being responsible for your community at the level of the political directorate, you have that responsibility. Let me just give you one example of what happened to me recently, and it's happening to me right now. I came out of office in Trinidad and Tobago after almost 10 years as Prime Minister. And an election came up, my party lost, a new government came into office. As Prime Minister, one of my duties was to chair the National Security Council. The new Prime Minister took that responsibility the day she came into office. She's now the chairman. There's no institutionalized handing over arrangement in our Westminster system that we practice here. But because of what Governor Savage just said, it is true that you need to have this passing of responsibility over. I wrote a Prime Minister a missive on the 20th of May, and I said, as outgoing chairman of the National Security Council, and you being incoming chairman of the National Security Council, I would like to speak to you on a couple matters of national security. And I gave her a window between the 20th of May and the 6th of June when I'll be available to do that. I got a response from the Prime Minister on the 10th of June saying, I don't want to talk to you.
So therefore, before we get into this very specific and local situation, there's several things that emerge from it. The question of transition from administration to administration in political culture, it appears, as a broad term, needs to be changed so that information at the level of the highest political office can be transferred from one person to the other person who takes on the responsibility.
I'll go further than
Yes.
that. The Waj Isaacs report, incidentally, Isaacs was a classmate of mine, and he replaced me at Seismic when I left Seismic in 91. That report should have been required reading for anybody with any authority on the island of Montserrat.
Totally agree.
I came here and spent my weekend on a Sunday evening talking to people on this issue. And to hear after that, well, nobody knew where the report was or that the report ever existed. But I told you what was happening is that people, and it's not only in Montserrat, it's happening right now in other territories in this region and in other countries outside this region, where the idea of accepting, facing a situation that has such a disruptive requirement, we could,
Low probability, high impact.
You must know somebody who has an illness and is not keen to see a doctor.
Yes.
Because they have a difficulty in accepting the diagnosis. I'm sure you know somebody like that. I had a sister like that.
Yes.
Right? Sick and can have medical attention can be attacked. Just would not face the idea of a
Potential bad
diagnosis
news.
that was dire. And here in the Caribbean today, every government that has a volcanic threat, have a dormant volcano in your community, has a requirement to know about it, to know about the risk. Otherwise, you are unfit for purpose as leader of that community.
I think what Keith describes well exactly what is happening in Dominica now.
But
So if you were to ask me before Soufriere erupted, when you spoke about your listing, my listing before Soufriere 2020, the top of that listing was Dominica. My listing now is still Dominica.
Gentlemen, we only have a few minutes left, as I understand, from a scheduling and programming standpoint at ZJB. And I know, obviously, this kind of discussion could go significantly longer. But in the remaining few minutes...
No. Before you go into your remaining few minutes, I just want to respond to Keith.
So the remaining few minutes will get even fewer now to focus on living with the volcano for Montserrat.
No, this is a conversation, so let's not... there are many of us, and it's reasonable that all of us inside here are men. And other than Frank, we're black men. Every man over the age of 40 is likely to have a prostate issue. Many of us are unwilling to do the very simple test to determine our prostate condition. And then we end up with stage 4, which is too late. But the test is simple, but many men think it's too intrusive. Okay? And we can use the volcano in that light, that yes, we know the volcano is there. What the hell, I'm going to build my house there, or I'm going to do that. Okay? I think Frank wanted to have a
but as I said,
statement.
we'd still like to get your perspectives on living with the volcano going forward for Montserrat. So after Mr. Savage speaks, I'd invite each of you to say briefly, Montserrat, living with the volcano, the future.
I just want to pick up a point from Keith. In the UK, and I think it's the same in most countries, an incoming government are denied access to the papers of previous governments. You are not allowed as a premier, as the chief minister, as the head of government, you are not allowed access to your predecessors and his predecessors' government's papers. That is the role of public servants. And in England, the Cabinet Office are the custodians of public records, and public servants are required when an incoming government is starting to rubbish their predecessors. It's up to the Cabinet Office people to put the record straight, to ensure that the lessons from previous governments are not lost sight of and to move forward. The point I wanted to make, and this will come across as very defensive, I am the only person from the Montserrat crisis that has stood before a court of law twice. I'm the only person who could have been found guilty of manslaughter of the death of the 14 people here.
19.
19 is a figure that has always been officially
19.
stated.
It is 19. I appeared before a Montserrat coroner's court to account for my role where the 19 people died on that fateful day, before a Montserratian jury. It was very significant. I was advised by the British legal advisor not to attend. I defied that advice because it was important that I defended the actions of myself and the Montserrat government and public service during that period. But the law on which I was potentially accountable to carried a manslaughter conviction of 14 years if I had been found guilty. And I could have been found guilty for contempt of court had I refused to answer some of the questions. There were some significant security issues. You will be aware of the early advice and information we were getting from an American surveillance program, which I think it's public knowledge now, but at the time was highly sensitive. And had I refused to answer questions on that, it would have been contempt of court. I also appeared before a Commons Select Committee of 14 MPs who were determined. They were attacking the British government, but I was their face of the British government for what they believed was a lack of support for Montserrat throughout this period. And it was a very hostile and uncomfortable position to be in. But that's part of the role, that's part of the job. I know Keith would have been in a similar position as in his country. But as scientists, you are advisors, most important advisors, without whom Montserrat would not have been saved. And I think I can say, on behalf of Ruben as well, we worked excessively closely with all the scientists. We appreciated what they did by coming to our community. And some of the scientists put themselves in personal danger at times on our behalf. But the bottom line is, whatever you did, you were advising us. There was a risk of a loss of your reputation if you got it wrong, but it's only this end of the table where we risk legal sanctions for could have been taking scientific advice, which was wrong, and people died. The onus would have fallen on us and not on the scientists. I say that because I'm so full of admiration for the work of all the scientists that came. And I'm proud that in that period, a number of PhD students came and have gone on to, we've now got the head of the MVO. We've got 2 or 3 prominent Montserratians who've moved on into that profession.
Gentlemen,
sorry about that confession.
We're looking to wrap up the program, and we do thank JJB, the management, and the on-air team for giving us the extra space and time. But I know we're very close to the end now. And so I invite you, Living with the Volcano, the future of Montserrat, each of the 3 of you.
I would say that Montserrat is what's has happened, what's done has been done. There's a buried city of Plymouth, which is some element of a volcanic a touristic curiosity right now. Not much can be done about that now. But having said that, Montserrat is in a much better place now to develop what's left of the island and to be a community that is living with a natural hazard, that's a volcano. Volcanic monitoring, the technology, the science has advanced a lot in the last 30 years. Even this week we were getting new insights into latest developments. So there are no other alternatives available but to monitor the volcano, be in a position to try to determine the course of any eruption that may come our way, and also to make that difficult decision, if and when it comes, as to a timely withdrawal, or better still, whether you can remain in close contact and be relatively safe. Volcanoes are hazards. Hazards carry risks. Governments determine what level of risks the population should be or would be exposed to. And those are the elements of that formula. And I think Montserrat is still nice. And the center and north of Montserrat, relatively safe from the actions of the south of Montserrat. And the land use pattern can now confidently be established where occupying, for whatever reason, the south at different times for different reasons, different purposes, knowing that what you go do there may be destroyed maybe 50 years, 100 years, 30 years from now. But the center and the north of Montserrat are relatively safe. They survived fair-sized eruption. The eastern coast below the volcano, the western coast you stay away from. And over time, that dormancy that Governor Savage spoke about, being told about the dormant volcano. Most volcanoes in the world are in a dormant state. And that dormancy is not timed by a week or two or by a clock. But you've got to know that it can be broken by something very strong, very disruptive, very destructive. So living in a dormant volcano, even our friends in Dominica, they need not panic. But what needs to happen in Dominica? Development on the island should be as dispersed as possible, so that in the event that one of those volcanoes begin to be a Montserrat-type problem, you can move to the other area, because Dominica is much larger than Montserrat, but it's also more mountainous. And each mountain there, every one of those peaks, is a dormant volcano. And you don't know which one is going to be the next one to erupt. So if you concentrate your development in one area, or only acknowledge that Roseau is the capital and everything goes to the capital is the most exposed place. That is the main problem we have. The capital, like Plymouth, is the most exposed place to what we know now. So, but if in going forward you disperse as far as you are able to, develop new communities, new infrastructure, new facilities elsewhere on the island, in the event of an eruption on any one of those volcanoes, you have a space to withdraw to. On the small islands like Statia and Nevis, in the event of an eruption, depending on what is happening, even from the early days, you may not have the physical, geographical opportunity to withdraw on island. And plans need to be made. And the population needs to have that as part of its understanding going forward in the event of the day coming when you have been told that something is happening on the mountain and we are in grave danger.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowley. And Dr. Robertson?
Well, just continue on with what Keith said. In terms of living in a volcano, I think I reinforced what I said. I think you need to look at the volcanic hazard and what it is likely to do and how it is likely to impact on the whole of Montserrat, and develop Montserrat in the context of living with and managing the hazard levels in different spaces and utilizing it as required. So I know there are lots of thinking about what's going to happen with the South. I think I would work a lot more with the capacity that you have at the MVO. I think there's a perception that the MVO is staffed by people who are really focused on volcanoes and volcanic hazard. But really what you have in the MVO is a resource of scientific ability that on a small island is unusual to have. And I would utilize the capacity that you have there to inform your decision making in terms of what you do in the South. But certainly, like Keith said, I agree. Montserrat is in a much better position to manage the space that it has now and decide on what it wants to do with that space and use that as a mechanism for pushing forward and really continuing to live with the hazard that you have. But, it's still nice and it's still, have a lot of potential.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robertson. And closing thoughts on Premier Mead?
Yeah, it was such a pleasure having my 4 very good friends with me in the studio today. And I am absolutely certain that the listening public were enthralled by the discussion. So, my brothers, thank you very much.
So, gentlemen, all that's left for me to do is to thank you also and to thank Radio Montserrat for allowing me, a former permanent secretary with responsibility for broadcasting, to come and get a feel for what it's like to be on this side of the microphone in distinguished company. So just closing off by reminding you, today we were joined by, on my far left, Dr. Richard Robertson, and to his right, the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, but principally today in his capacity as a scientist, a volcanologist, Dr. Keith Rowley, and to my immediate right, former Governor of Montserrat. We all know him as Frank Savage. What other names you see on paper, Frank Savage is the one we know him by. And of course, Honorable Premier Reuben T. Mead. I'm Frankie Michael, wishing everyone a great day and saying continue to participate in SHV 30. It's a very important conference. It's a conference not only of national and regional, but global significance. Thank you for the privilege. Have a good day.
Keeping Montserrat alive. This is 95.5, 88.3 FM, ZJB Radio.
Listening into ZJB Radio, 95.5, 88.3.